Okay, well, welcome everyone. We are so excited to see each other. I know it's been a while. I think this couple of months has been a time for readjustment for many of us for many reasons. But I'm very glad that to see each other and for Omar Figueroa for accepting the invitation to present part of his research dissertation work. Thank you, Omar, for being here and for your work on disaster resilience and how you have been like working very diligent in this topic that's very important for us as planners and researchers in Puerto Rico. Before we get started, I'd like to invite everyone to introduce themselves briefly. I know some of us already know each other, but for the benefit of Omar Perez, I think that will be very helpful. Thank you so much.
Yo soy en inglés o en español. I guess in English. Okay, that's how you announced it. Yeah, I'm a professor at Fordham University Lincoln Center, and I'm also working on a project that I told uh, Mari. No, not Mari. Anyway, on a project. I have an article on a project in Boquerón, Puerto Rico. It's not part of the British billionaires, right? It's part of an environmental project that I began a number of years ago. So, we have a home there and try to go every year during the summers, of course. Yeah.
No, excellent. I can also introduce myself, and then I let like Lucila introduce herself. Just because I'm close to Cabo Rojo to Clara, right? So I'm from San Germán originally, and then Omar, I know I'm just saying things that maybe you didn't know, but I went to school in San Germán in Inter-American
Oh, okay.
University, and then for my master's, I went to the University of New Mexico. I saw that you went to Barcelona. I was like, wow, I wonder how many people go through from UPR to Barcelona these days to do their school. Like in the old times. I don't know. I'm just playing. And yeah, I'm very interested in like listening to your talk because I have been learning a little bit about water as well. So thank you for being here. And then maybe Lucila, you want to go next?
Yes, I can't seem to get rid of the video. The Omar's slide is wonderful to look at, but it's hiding everything else on my screen. But I'm here and I'm pleased to be here. And a very exciting thing has happened, privileged thing has happened to me recently, which is the archive. All my work of 50, 55, almost 60 years is now at the archives at the School of Architecture at the University of Puerto Rico. So it's all there from the very beginning, from my planning studies to starting working with communities and bringing different experiences in Puerto Rico into the planning field, such as the Parcelas program, which nobody was paying any attention to whatsoever in the planning field, and the Division of Community Education. So it's all there now, and it was a big effort, and I'm very pleased, of course. So other than that, the other four authors and myself are working on updating a presentation of our Planificación para Puerto Rico Sostenible, Fundamentos del Proceso. It's been almost 8 years since the book was published, and it's time to update it. It's in Spanish and put it into English. That's it in a nutshell. And it's nice to see you all, Evis.
Yeah, nice to see you as well. And I love that museum in the School of Architecture. And actually, like it was like Francisco, he left from UIUC, from UPR.
That's correct. He's in
Yeah,
Chicago.
he's in
No,
Omar School
he's
in
at
He's in Penn.
UIUC.
That's right.
Yeah.
He's dean
Yes,
there.
yeah. Yeah, and they're actually doing some work there with like I went to the Puerto Rican community last week and I learned that they're envisioning the in the School of Architecture the Paseo Boricua where our Puerto Ricans are. So that's like really cool, all these connections, you know. Um,
Yeah.
maybe we can go to Daniel and then Mari. Daniel, you can also introduce yourself in the chat. I don't know if oh, you're calling from Vieques.
Yeah,
Wow.
Daniel already introduced in the chat. I don't know. I will read it.
Yeah,
Danielle
good.
Vaz, she is also original from Puerto Rico. Currently, she is New York City. She has a master in urban and community planning from Pratt Institute, whose research centers around housing, equitable disaster recovery, and climate change adaptation for disadvantaged communities. And currently, she is in Vieques, maybe having some vacations.
And then Mari, I see you're double here because probably you had issue with your audio, but hopefully you can introduce yourself.
Can you hear me?
Sí, te escuchamos.
Yep.
Okay. Mari Villarini, I'm a planner from Puerto Rico. What else do you want to know? I am more or less retired.
No, you're not retired.
It's a it's a new retirement, right? Keep working, but like on your own
Exactly.
time. Well,
Just more or
welcome.
less.
Sí, bienvenida, bienvenida, Mari.
Gracias.
Entonces, Leili, ¿tú vas a presentar a Omar? Ujú.
Great. Well, today we are excited to have Omar Perez Figueroa with us. Omar is an assistant professor of urban and regional planning at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He's dedicated to supporting underrepresented communities in addressing environmental inequities, particularly those impacted by extreme weather and water injustices. He's also affiliated with the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies and the Urban Champaign Institute for Sustainability and Energy and Environment. In his presentation, Omar will discuss his dissertation work on understanding resilience through the Iceland community. And before we begin, a few quick notes. This section will last around 20 minutes and we will follow by a Q&A segment. Invite everyone to submit your questions in the chat during the presentation as well, and we will address them during the Q&A. Thank you. Omar, this is your stage. Thank you.
Okay. So I gotta say that the excitement is mutual. I met Evie's maybe like two, or it was a little bit while ago. So I started my PhD in 2017, and so I remember at the time I was trying to identify other planners that they were doing work in Puerto Rico that I could draw from, right? And so Evie's was one of those colleagues that I was able to identify early on. And so, I was excited to be here today sharing my work. And on the low key, I was like, I hope that one day they'll invite me to present my work. And so, it didn't happen. It did happen, right? So for today, I will be presenting my dissertation. And then in the interest of time, I will present only one of the chapter, which I think it covers more or less a big chunk of my dissertation, but I'm happy to go back to the other chapters and have further conversations. So with that in mind, I'll start. So the first thing that you see here, it's an image. So throughout my presentation, you'll see images from like local artists and people that depicts, how they're feeling, experiencing some of the issues that I cover throughout my research. So here's the title of my dissertation, Disaster Recovery in Puerto Rico, Understanding Resilience for the Island Communities. So here are some pictures, I think we're pretty familiar with the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, but because my dissertation and the interviews and data from my research, it's from this time. I'll like to bring some pictures and images that reminds us of that time to kind of like set up the context. So here's an overview of my presentation. I'll start talking a little bit about the research background, then I'll move on to talk about the study themes and research questions, moving on to chapters and finding. And after that, I'll talk about the research and theoretical implications, and I'll close out with limitations and future research. So my research is situated in the Caribbean. And so populations living in this region are exposed to sea level rise and poor infrastructure. And because of heavily reliance on weather sensitive sectors, such as tourism, agriculture, and risk are expected to worsen, right? And so one of the things that I did with my dissertation, and I continue to do so, it's bring not only Puerto Rico, but also the Caribbean as an area that it needs to be researched on, right? And so not only because they have experience in the past or in recent times, many disasters, and those impacts are disproportionately large compared to neighboring regions, but also the Caribbean and Puerto Rico provide critical insights towards the interpretation of how communities cope with disasters when limited political power, including unjust social and environmental conditions. So moving to my study themes and taking into consideration the previous conditions in the Caribbean and Puerto Rico, I am interested in investigating how effective disaster resilience needs to incorporate the goals of environmental equity and community empowerment under our current climate change context. This dissertation seeks to understand how diverse communities in Puerto Rico cope and understand extreme weather events such as hurricane. This research is driven by the overarching research question: how collective mobilization serve as a vehicle to manage hazards and access vital resources, mainly when those communities have limited resources. So here are my 3 chapters highlighted with each of the research question. So each of my empirical chapter address that question in different levels, right? And so for the first one, I wanted to look at virtual communities, right? And so I was looking at Twitter, now X. And for that one, I was trying to answer, our aim was to answer how can social media communication be harnessed to engage and mobilize citizens effectively. And our second chapter was more specific into looking at the case of independent community aqueducts. And so for that chapter, I was looking at what is the impact of resource mobilization on disaster resilience and water governance. And the third chapter was looking at how diverse framings of resilience shape community aqueducts disaster recovery efforts. And within that chapter, I had a second question around what is the role of water issues in operationalization resilience for community aqueducts. So there are many ways that one can engage and do this type of research. And so the way that I approached my research was through a community engaged approach. And so back then, I had a colleague that was working with El Bosque Modelo. And El Bosque Modelo had done previously a project with community aqueducts in Puerto Rico, but that project had come to an end, and so they were looking for someone basically to, provide support. And so we began this partnership, and within this partnership, I was able to interview community aqueducts residents, and operators, and other stakeholders. And so it was through this exchange that this research came to be as a result of their input and own research questions, right? And so specifically between those conversations led to 5 specific workshops on trying to address their specific needs. And while I was conducting and creating those workshops, it was when I conducted the research, including some ethnographic abroad interviews. I have over 100 hours of qualitative data for this research. So here I present my theoretical approach, which are the lenses I focus to analyze my research. I mobilize theories from social sciences that defines environmental hazard within environmental justice frame. I then combine it with a critical approach to water governance and resource mobilization theory. I believe that a resilient society must be one that acknowledges social movements and environmental justice as means to cope with hazard, and that this resilience is enacted by local water governing bodies. The combination of these three elements are key to analyze resilience from the ground up, allowing me to observe how diverse forms of defining resilience emerge and what are the implications of said definitions. So my dissertation research is located in Puerto Rico. And so like I mentioned in the beginning, Puerto Rico can provide unique insight in terms of how and what are these communities are doing to address their impact from environmental hazard. And so what I would want to showcase in the picture behind is the distribution of solidarity networks on the island and a community organizing to the right, creating a roadmap for recovery strategies, right? And so even before I started my research, communities were doing their own thing, were doing organizing, right? So, what I was trying to aim was to support that work and to shed light on some of those efforts. So a little bit of study setting, I think, since I feel most of us are familiar with the context of Puerto Rico, I don't want to spend too much time here. But this is more so the case for when I present the dissertation and my research for people that not may be familiar with what's happening on the island. So I always talked about how Puerto Rico is a U.S. colony, and that we have limited political power, that we have no representation of Congress, and that we have an aging power grid. And depending on fossil fuel, and that has been privatized, and and right now the infrastructure, the power infrastructure, it's really fragile, and they have raised the prices, and it's unsustainable. And now they're saying that the demand for power won't be enough over the summer, which means that we'll continue to have rolling blackouts on the island. And so all of that has been compounded by Promesa, which was an oversight fiscal control board appointed by Congress, right? And so the outcome of that oversight fiscal control board has been or has resulted in cuts to funding to hospital, in cuts in the education system, cuts to pension, and cuts in the EMT services. And so that, and even before Promesa came into effect, the island was going through an economic recession that continues to be impacted by the effects of Promesa. And in addition, these elements have pushed our migration, and we have seen a change in demographic resulting in reductions in the island's overall population and an increase in the elderly and the population living below poverty levels. Like I mentioned, in the interest of time, I'm gonna focus on the chapter 2. So I'm gonna skip on chapter 1, which is the analysis on social media. What were the main themes, what people said, and what some of the results. I'm happy to go back. But today's presentation, I wanted to focus on small water systems, right? I called it independent community aqueduct because they are a decenter water infrastructure, right? And so I was very interested in looking at how these small water systems in Puerto Rico were able to cope with disaster effects from Irma and Maria. And so for this specific chapter, I draw from a survey that were answered by aqueduct personnel, including volunteers, paid personnel, and water operators. I did two ordinary least square models to analyze the survey that identified and evaluated elements that provide resource mobilization to community aqueducts. And this chapter also includes some of my qualitative data. And so, maybe you're wondering why should we use resource mobilization, right? And so one of the things, and so typically resource mobilization, it's used of social movements. So I'm extending that literature into disaster management and environmental hazards, right? And so looking at resource mobilization, it's critical as it's one way to promote resilience during disaster and extreme weather events. The way that different stakeholders access and put resources in motion has an impact on the way they manage their water resources and deal with disasters. So drawing from resource mobilization theory, this chapter seeks to identify the conditions that give rise to resource mobilization in the face of cascading disasters and whether resource mobilizations affect disaster resilience. So I had two main hypotheses for this chapter. So the first one was that an increased participation in social networks from community aqueducts will increase in their resource mobilization score. And I'll go in a minute, like how I was able to create this score. And the second, that resource mobilization index has a positive impact for community aqueducts recovery time. So here's an image or scheme of community aqueducts. So this is kind of like a general idea for people that may not be familiar with community aqueducts and what they are and how they look like. So they have a main water reservoir at the center of the systems, and then two plumes and pipes. They take water, whether it's to homes, to schools, or to public pickup stations. Some of these systems are powered now with solar infrastructure, but many of them are dependent on electricity, and even a few are worked through gravity, right? This is physical infrastructure of the system. The part that I'm also interested in is who are the people organizing and managing these systems, right? And so typically they are formed by a governing board, has a president, a treasurer, a secretary. But many of the system, it's really Juan and Maria that they get up in the morning, they pull the lever and, they deliver water to their communities. Some of these systems can be quite small, so they can provide water to 25 houses, and other systems are like, rather big, providing, water to 1,000, 2,000 homes, right? And so in overall, they provide water to, this is the latest estimate. This is, I updated this figure after my dissertation. So we're talking about roughly 5% of the people on the island. So that's roughly 150,000 people. And it used to be 200,000, but it had come down a little bit, and I can also talk why that is. Many of the systems obtain their water from 68 from groundwater, and the 30 obtain their water from surface, whether that's a river or small creeks. And many of these systems operate under violation of drinking water clean act. And so many of these communities, they have limited know-how. They have an aging population and high poverty levels. So here's an overview of the constructs that I use. So basically what I measure for that survey. And so I combine research capacity, research mobilization, social networks that we know from research are big in terms of disaster recovery, measuring disaster resilience, right? And water governance. So I created a research mobilization score. So basically I to operationalize research mobilization, I combine these 6 elements in one, and I averaged them. And so the research mobilization score also was tested for reliability using Cronbach alpha with a 0.80. So we put the survey together. We piloted with many stakeholders, making sure that the language was aligned with the people and the way that the questions were framed, right? And so at the time, there were 241 community aqueducts, and so we sent out the survey to all of them. And so we had actually quite a really high response rate. And so I end up getting 39 responses, and so 23 were by postal mail, and 16 were online. So here's the map where I showcase the community aqueduct location and where I received the survey response. And so you'll see that community aqueducts are located through the center of the island, and that's where uh, where it's higher in rural and altitude, which is where most community aqueduct, if not all, are located. And so this has to do with kind of like historical component of like how some communities organized in these rural areas, and there wasn't any water infrastructure, and so they started in the early 30s, 40s, creating their own water infrastructure that some of them were able to modernize, not all of them. And they continue to be that same infrastructure from the time that were created. And so I had, in total 26 municipalities represented in my sample from the 78 that compose the archipelago of Puerto Rico. And so here it's my first model. For this model, I'm trying to understand what influenced a community aqueduct resource mobilization. So here I'm regressing different variables on the resource mobilization score I previously created. So for these models, the variables that were impacting resource mobilizations were percentage of women working on the aqueduct, how many networks aqueducts participated on, participation frequency in community activities, total faith-based organizations in the community, and funds obtained after Hurricane Maria. And so for the percentage of women working in the aqueducts, and so you will see there a negative coefficient, that negative coefficient means that, and this was highlighted with and supported with some of the interviews from my research, saying that when all of the members of the community aqueduct that run that particular community aqueduct were women, it was harder for them to operate the aqueduct, which affect their research mobilization score. And so definitely, correlation or, total faith organizations, the more religious organizations in the community, the higher the research mobilization scores, the more networks that people in the community aqueducts participated, more research or capacity to mobilize resources. And the more people participated, and this is for the participation frequency in community variable, the more research they were able to mobilize. And so here for model B, I'm trying to understand what elements impacted disaster recovery, specifically if research mobilization impacted somehow disaster recovery. So here I'm regressing different variables on disaster recovery and measures an average. And so disaster recovery here was measured as the time of average to regain water, electricity, and gas station services. In this model, the two variables that impact the recovery time were networks in which communities participated and main decision approach. The negative coefficient for the networks variable means that the more networks people participated in, the less time it took to recover, which is what we were looking for. And the main decision approach variable measure if the main decision approach from the community organization was mainly taken collectively or individually, kind of like a more vertical approach. And so significant of these variables means that an increase in collective decisions result in an increase in recovery time, right? But take this with a grain of salt because, basically half of the aqueducts that answer the survey, their decision process was taken horizontally and the other half vertically, right? And so even though that it was significant in the variable of saying that the more community aqueducts took decisions vertically, the faster recovery time. That may have to do with some of the processes and time bound strategies they had to take in order to apply for funds. And I'm happy to talk more on that later. So doing a little bit of the recapping, we saw that aqueducts with higher community participation were associated with an increase in their research mobilization scores. That social networks led to a decrease in recovery time, right? So, this is good. And that mention how aqueducts took their decisions affected the recovery time. And this is for the second model, that research mobilization had no effect on recovery time, right? And so some of the limitations for these models were a sample size and omitted variable. And so I want to go briefly on chapter number 3, because I was equally interested in looking more closely at how communities aqueduct define resilience, right? And what was the role of water in operationalizing resilience for community aqueducts. So for this one, I use an ethnographic approach on 12 community aqueducts. So basically, I would go with them and I would, kind of like doctors do like shadow. I would hang out with them throughout all day, and through this process of the whole day, I was able to, look at their challenges and how they went about on their day-to-day challenges, right? And so I wanted to see how these communities that have often been framed as resilient, how they themselves saw as being resilient or not, and how they frame resilience, and if in fact they thought they were resilient, right? And so doing a little bit of theory, taking all the frameworks that are out there in terms of resilience, we can group them between looking at resilience as an outcome and resilient as a process. And so looking at as a process, recognize more a broad framework in terms of the input that humans can have in terms of creating plans and building capacity and sharing information for the context of recovery, right? And so I went into the field to see what's out there. And so definitely there were some people that agreed that, resilience as an outcome in terms of like going back to what their conditions were. But there were other community members that saw resilience more of a process, right? What are the actions that I have to do? Specifically on the short term, long term, and also giving the tools to people to be able to solve those issues, right? However, there was a third or 1/3 of my question and I call them as like no resilience. And it wasn't like there wasn't no resilience, but it was more so that, they didn't necessarily like agree with that framework. And so they tend to use more solidarity or mutual aid. And so basically, what I was able to identify and how communities from their actions and mobilizing resources were able to actually have resilient outcomes. So basically, communities came together to organize and mobilize around the issues of drinking water, right? And so it was through those mobilizations that they were able to build community and ownership, and through those collective processes end up resulting in resilient outcomes, right? And so what we learned from that chapter was that communities have different ways of understanding resilience, right? Some identify it more of a binding agent towards resilience. That networks provided faster spaces to build community and strategy building, and that this decentralized water system provide an alternative to foster resilience. So I'm gonna leave it at that and jump to the overarching findings from the whole dissertation. And so we saw that social media, governance processes, and community participation potential in shaping effective disaster resilience. The dissertation also highlight the role of water system as a vehicle to examine disaster resilient processes. I think that has been one of the big takeaways, and that collective decision making impact the recovery time of water systems, and continue to expand on people that use social networks and social ties as a way of understanding better these processes of recovering from disaster. We saw that solidarity definitely was a critical. And lastly, I was able to do a mixed method, more of water elements that community aqueducts identify that were shaping the recovery and resilience, and then more closely with through interviews and ethnographic approach, looking at those processes in detail. And so my last slide are for if you're interested in following up and expanding on some of my research. This dissertation is published, and we also were able to publish the chapter on social media from that I presented at the beginning. I didn't have so much time, and so we were able to also expand and publish on the issues of water governance and looking at the piece of public policy of looking at community aqueducts as a positive cases for public administration. And I'm right now working on the last piece of that looks more closely at the resilience framework. So with that, I'm gonna leave it for now and jump into my favorite part, which are the questions.
Well, excellent. That's a lot to digest.
Yeah, I know that it
Three
was 20
papers.
minutes, and so I was like, well, I'm happy to expand more on the Q&A.
Yeah.